welcome back. Or if this is your first time, thank you for joining us by the fire. Tonight we take a darker path and where justice wore the form of ropes, flames, and screams in the night. History is not just glory, but warnings etched in pain. When laws were born from fear, punishment became a public message. Do not make the same mistake. From ancient Babylon to medieval Europe, humans devised countless ways to punish. Hanging, burning, torture. Not just to punish, but to terrify. Today, we shudder at the thought. But back then, it was called justice. If you're ready, join Sleeping History on a journey through some of the most terrifying punishments in human history. Let us now journey back to the ancient world, an era that bore witness to some of the most terrifying punishments ever recorded, etched into the annals of time and passed down through generations. And first among them was being buried alive. Burial alive was not merely a method of execution. In many ancient cultures, it carried deep religious undertones, seen as an offering to appease the gods, to calm unseen forces beyond human control. But as religion gradually gave way to secular power, being buried alive transformed into a chilling deterrent, a punishment so horrifying that anyone who witnessed it would shudder and reconsider their own actions. In Mesopotamia, the cradle of human civilization, early legal texts like the Code of Hammurabi, around 1754 BCE, referenced executions by throwing into a pit or burying with the object of the crime. Though the wording stops short of explicitly saying buried alive, both historical practice and folklore suggest that this was indeed the grim reality. In ancient Egypt, it was believed that slaves and servants could accompany their pharaoh into the afterlife to continue serving him. Though these roles were later replaced by small funerary figurines known as shabti, there was a time when real, living people were forced to lie still and be sealed within the tomb, alive, swallowed by eternal darkness. In the East, ancient China also practiced live burial in varying contexts, from small sacrificial rituals to large-scale political repression. During the Qin dynasty, the infamous Emperor Qin Shi Huang, known for the Great Wall and his terracotta army, left behind another darker legacy, the burial of 460 Confucian scholars alive. According to records of the Grand Historian by Sima Qian, this was the result of a harsh legalist policy aimed at extinguishing dissenting thought. In 213 BCE, Qin Shi Huang ordered the burning of books that didn't serve the state ideology. A year later, hundreds of Confucian scholars were accused of criticizing the regime, speaking of past kings, uttering improper words, and were sentenced to be buried alive in the capital, Xianyang. While the exact number remains debated, the story captures a grim truth. Burial alive was not just to kill, it was to terrify, to silence opposition. There's something uniquely horrifying about this method. Unlike beheading or burning, live burial subjects the victim to a slow, conscious death. A death drawn out in darkness, where every heartbeat seems to echo against the walls of earth. Victims didn't die instantly. They might survive for hours, sometimes even a full day, suffocating slowly under cold soil. It was psychological torture in its purest form. For many societies, it was also a way to erase someone entirely. No grave, no tombstone, no place to mourn. Their name wiped from history, that to them was a complete death. This punishment wasn't exclusive to Asia or the Middle East. In ancient Greece, records mention women who committed adultery being buried up to their necks in dirt, left under the sun to die slowly. In Rome, Vestal virgins who broke their vows of chastity were entombed alive in sealed chambers, because executing a priestess of Vesta was seen as sacrilegious. So they buried her and left her fate in the hands of the gods. Even into the medieval period, the practice never fully disappeared. In parts of early medieval Europe, witches, traitors, or those labelled as heretics were sometimes buried alive, especially in times of chaos, when law was more rumour than rule. Today, burial alive is considered one of the most inhumane punishments in human history. But once upon a time, it was a standard of justice, a grim reminder that history isn't written only in ink and parchment, but in blood, in earth, and in the final breaths of those who are buried and forgotten. Next, we come to one of the most gruesome and terrifying punishments in the history of ancient China: 5 horses dismemberment, also known as quartering by 5 horses. Emerging during the Warring States period and lasting all the way through the end of the Qing dynasty, this punishment represents the rawest interpretation of a chilling belief that pain could awaken morality, that fear could enforce obedience. This was no mere execution, it was a public display of brutality meant to shake the soul. Quartering by 5 horses is believed to have originated from the penal codes of the Qin dynasty, 221 BCE, and was later incorporated into the legal systems of the Han, Tang, Ming, and Qing dynasties. It was reserved for those guilty of the gravest crimes: treason, regicide, rebellion, or the murder of imperial family members. It was a punishment of both ultimate physical destruction and spiritual humiliation, for ancient Chinese believed that only a complete body could allow the soul to pass peacefully into the afterlife. The execution was performed in public. The condemned would be tightly bound, hands, feet, and neck each tied with thick ropes, each rope connected to a horse. At the command, 5 horses would be whipped into 5 opposing directions, tearing the person's body apart. Blood sprayed, bones snapped, and screams echoed through the air. The crowd would gather tightly, some shielding the eyes of children, others fainting at the sight. But the officials, they nodded solemnly, satisfied that justice had been served. One of the most haunting incidents related to this punishment did not occur in a court of law, but in the imperial harem. It was the notorious vengeance of Empress Lu Ji, the first empress of the Han dynasty, upon concubine Qi, a beloved consort of Emperor Liu Bang. Concubine Qi was not only favoured by the emperor, but had borne him a son, Prince Liu Rui, who became a threat to Empress Lu and her own lineage. After Liu Bang's death in 195 BCE, Lu Ji seized power and began to cleanse the palace. Concubine Qi was imprisoned, but not immediately executed. Instead, she was subjected to a series of horrifying tortures, recorded in Sima Qian's records of the Grand Historian. Her limbs were severed, her eyes gouged out, her ears cut off, her tongue poisoned to silence her. She was called the human pig, thrown into a pen to live among pigs and chickens. Later, Empress Lu invited the crown prince to see her and said, "This is the woman who once hoped to replace your mother." Although concubine Qi was not officially executed by 5-horse dismemberment, later folklore and oral tradition suggest that her son, Liu Rui, may have met that exact fate. When Empress Lu heard whispers that Liu Rui could be reinstated as heir, she had him poisoned, or according to some accounts, torn apart, ensuring his body could not be buried whole. The historical accuracy of this particular event remains debated, but one fact is beyond doubt: Empress Lu's cruelty was legendary. The purpose of 5-horse dismemberment was not just to kill, it was to turn the victim into a living lesson. In a time when law was deeply entwined with ritual and imperial supremacy, public executions like this served as a devastating show of authority. But as legal and moral standards evolved in the 18th and 19th centuries, such punishments began to be viewed as savage and inhumane. By 1905, in the twilight years of the Qing dynasty, the 5-horse dismemberment, along with other brutal forms of capital punishment, was officially abolished. Still, its memory lingers. A horrific echo from a time when justice meant fear, and when the price of disobedience was being torn limb from limb before the eyes of an empire. On the other side of the world, in the ancient city of Agrigentum, a Greek city-state located on what is now the island of Sicily, Italy, the sea breeze howled through rows of white stone columns. The air was thick with the scent of salt, sweat, and the acrid tang of burning metal. At the centre of the plaza, a crowd had gathered, eyes wide, mouths agape. There, in the middle, stood a towering bronze statue, a bull rearing its head skyward, as if roaring in defiance of the gods. But this was no artwork. It was an instrument of execution. The brazen bull, also known as the bronze bull, was the creation of a Greek artisan named Perillos of Athens. With great craftsmanship, he forged a hollow bronze bull with a hatch on its side, designed so that a victim could be placed inside. Beneath its belly, a bed of coals. Once ignited, the entire statue would glow red-hot, turning it into a giant oven of death. But Perillos didn't stop at engineering, he also had a flair for acoustics. Inside the bull's head, he installed a system of copper tubes crafted so that the screams of the person being roasted alive would echo outward, transformed into deep, eerie, bull-like bellows, a grotesque symphony of agony. According to Roman historians like Diodorus Siculus, Perillos brought this invention to Phalaris, the tyrant of Agrigentum, infamous for his cruelty. Perillos promised that the bull wouldn't just eliminate enemies in an artful way, but would also inspire awe and terror in the people, cementing Phalaris's power. Phalaris listened and nodded, then gave a simple order: "Let's test it. Right now, on you." And just like that, Perillos, ingenious, inventive, but lacking a conscience, became the first victim of his own creation. He was thrown into the belly of the bull, the hatch slammed shut, flames were lit beneath, the bronze began to glow, first golden, then orange, then a blistering red. Perillos' screams, no longer a persuasive pitch, were twisted through the pipes, emerging as mournful roars. Some accounts say Phalaris ordered the bull open just before Perillos died, only to throw him off a cliff. Some say it was to avoid tainting the bull with a traitor's corpse. Others say it was a final flourish of cruelty, extending the pain as punishment for crafting such a monstrous device. But the death of Perillos was not the end of the bloodshed. The brazen bull became Phalaris's favourite instrument of execution. Anyone who defied him, rebels, politicians, philosophers, or even someone who said the wrong thing at a banquet, could be shoved into the bull's searing belly. The brazen bull was not just a method of killing, it was a performance, a message, a spectacle meant to paralyse the public with fear. From the 6th century BCE onward, the tale of the bronze bull echoed through the ages, from Greece to Rome, from legend to recorded history. Although archaeologists have yet to uncover a fully preserved specimen, ancient plays, texts and illustrations describe its design in striking detail, and in a final twist of poetic justice. When the Romans overthrew Phalaris, they sentenced him to die in the very bull he had once used to terrorise others, ending his reign of horror with the same fire he had wielded so mercilessly. After the screams faded inside the red-hot brazen bull, a long silence followed. But in many ancient cultures, especially in Persia and India, silence did not always come from death. Sometimes it came from a punishment far more chilling: tongue removal. No burning, no beheading, no dismemberment. Instead, a far more symbolic and refined form of torture, severing one's ability to speak. In societies where words could spark rebellion, offend kings or shake faith, speech was no longer merely a tool of wisdom. It became a double-edged sword, and those who didn't wield their tongue carefully often lost it permanently. In ancient Persia, particularly under the Sasanian Empire, 224–651 CE, protecting the purity of the Zoroastrian faith was paramount. This religion held that lies were among the gravest sins, tantamount to betrayal of the divine. Those accused of heresy or of spreading ideas contrary to Zoroastrian doctrine were often punished by tongue excision, a permanent silence to stop the spread of evil. One story, preserved in ancient Syriac texts, tells of Mahbed Nasi, a Christian monk living within Sasanian territory. He publicly criticised fire worship and refused to convert to Zoroastrianism. By decree of the magistrate in Ctesiphon, Nasi was bound, his mouth pried open with iron clamps, and his tongue was cut out, while fully conscious. Eyewitnesses said he did not scream. He simply let out a faint moan and lifted his face to the sky as blood poured down his priestly robe. In ancient India, especially under the Maurya 3115 BCE and later Gupta empires, this punishment also existed, primarily for blasphemy or slandering royalty. The laws of Manu, a cornerstone of Hindu ethics and jurisprudence, stated, "He who insults a Brahmin or the gods with words shall suffer the punishment of eternal silence." At major temples in cities like Varanasi or Jain, there are records of offenders being tied to stone pillars, their mouths forced open with red-hot metal clamps, and priests using ritual sickle-shaped knives to sever their tongues on the spot. Afterward, they were cleansed in the waters of the Ganges River, though many succumbed to shock, blood loss or infection soon after. More than a religious act, tongue-cutting also became a political tool, used to censor scholars, poets, and philosophers with dissenting ideas. During the reign of Shapur II, 309–379 CE, many Syriac scholars suspected of fraternizing with Rome, or spreading false faiths, were punished this way. Church historian Eusebius even referenced an event known as the 10 Tongues Severed, a public execution of 10 preachers silenced before a crowd. Things grew darker toward the end of the Sasanian era, when religious wars ignited, In some cases, no evidence was needed. Just a public accusation that someone had said something wrong was enough for a conviction. Likewise, in India, during the reign of King Pushyamitra Shunga, 185–149 BCE, notorious for his anti-Buddhist stance, there were records of mass tongue removals of monks and missionaries accused of polluting Aryan faith. While decapitation or burning brought death, cutting out the tongue left the victim alive, yet silent. They carried this punishment for the rest of their lives, a living warning to others about the cost of unregulated speech. In parts of Persia, after the tongue was removed, the mouth was sometimes sealed with metal or sewn shut to prevent communication through gestures. In India, survivors were often banished from temples, deemed deprived of divine blessing, and lived out their days as silent outcasts. To this day, inscriptions and ancient texts across the Middle East preserve accounts of such punishments. Some carvings depict the scene in vivid relief: a raised hand holding a blade, a face tilted skyward, and a gaping mouth, blood gushing like a crimson fountain. Perhaps no punishment is as quietly horrifying as tongue removal, where silence isn't golden, but a permanent scar of a past denied its right to speak. History, if not recorded and passed down, would be unbelievable. Laws have always existed, but surely you'd agree. Today's punishments are far more humane and civilized. As we leave behind the ancient world and enter the Middle Ages, a time when life could be snatched away for a careless word, a different belief, or even just staring at the king too long, impalement was no longer just a form of punishment. It became a bloody political statement. And at the very pinnacle of this terrifying method, no one is more infamous than Vlad III of Wallachia, later known as Vlad the Impaler, or to many the real Dracula. Vlad III was born in 1431 in Transylvania, the son of Vlad the Sir Dracul, a member of the Order of the Dragon, a chivalric order founded by Emperor Sigismund to defend Christianity against the Ottoman threat. The name Dracula means son of Dracul, but under Vlad's reign, that name would become a symbol of unspeakable horror. During his time as ruler of Wallachia, Vlad III faced countless threats, from rebellious noblemen to the brutal advance of the Ottoman Empire. He didn't choose diplomacy, he chose the stake. Historical records state that in a single campaign, he impaled over 20,000 captured Ottoman soldiers, creating what became known as the Forest of the Impaled, along the road to the capital Târgoviște. Massive wooden stakes, each 3 to 5 meters tall, held the bodies of prisoners pierced from below. Blood dripped slowly onto the dry, cracked earth. When Ottoman troops saw the spectacle, they didn't advance. They turned and fled. Impalement was not a quick death. In fact, it was engineered to be slow, agonizing, and mentally devastating. The process began by stripping the prisoner naked and tying them down. A long wooden stake, sharpened to a dull point and often greased with animal fat, was carefully inserted into the anus or vagina. Sometimes the tip was made deliberately blunt, so it wouldn't puncture vital organs right away, but instead push them aside, prolonging life and extending agony for 2 to 3 days. The stake would then be raised upright, with the victim slowly hoisted above using ropes or pulleys. The full weight of their body would drive the stake upward, inch by inch, in a horrifyingly slow ascent to death. Some accounts from Western envoys reported that victims could scream or moan for hours until the stake finally exited their mouth or pierced the heart. For Vlad, impalement wasn't just punishment. It was a message, loud, clear, and soaked in blood. He impaled dishonest nobles, petty thieves, adulterous women, regardless of class or status. At one banquet, he invited hundreds of noblemen to a feast. After dinner, he had them all arrested and impaled, declaring it an act to cleanse the land of traitors. In another infamous incident, an Ottoman envoy refused to remove his turban before Vlad, citing religious tradition. Vlad responded by having the turban nailed to the man's skull, saying, "Then keep it on, forever." No one took Vlad lightly. Though praised by the Pope and many European nobles as a defender of Christianity, to the common folk he was a living nightmare, a shadow in the forest surrounded by sharpened stakes that stood like the teeth of wolves. The image of Vlad the Impaler and his forest of death entered both history and folklore. Centuries later, Bram Stoker would borrow his name to create the legendary vampire Count Dracula. But Vlad III didn't need to become a vampire to spread terror. His very presence, His sharp beard, unblinking stare, blood-soaked banquets and wooden stakes was enough to chill the blood of an entire continent. Under Vlad's hand, impalement ceased to be just a legal sentence. It became a symbol of absolute power, total control, and the terrifying dark side of medieval politics. One of the most brutal forms of execution in history, a method designed not just to kill but to make the condemned feel death arriving inch by inch, was lingqi. Known in English as the death by 1,000 cuts, lingqi first appeared during China's 5 dynasties and 10 kingdoms period and persisted for nearly a millennium, lasting all the way into the Qing dynasty. It was reserved for the gravest offences: treason, assassination of royalty, or offences against the emperor himself. The condemned would be bound standing or sitting, and then, piece by piece, their body would be sliced apart, from the cheeks, nose and ears to arms, chest and thighs, until either death came or there was nothing left but a blood-soaked skeleton. Depending on the severity of the sentence, a person might suffer anywhere from dozens to over 3,000 cuts. Some executions dragged on for up to 3 days, with hundreds of cuts each day, sufficient not only to shred the body but to break the soul. One of the most infamous lingqi cases in the late Qing dynasty involved Liu Jingxi, Lu Kim Hai, a powerful eunuch in the inner circle of Li Lianying, Li Lianan, the most feared and influential court eunuch under Empress Dowager Tixi. Liu was Li's confidant and had been entrusted with managing the imperial treasure vaults of Summer Palace. But greed got the better of him. He stole precious relics, falsified records, and even smuggled priceless Qing dynasty artifacts to Europe in exchange for silver and gold through secret deals with foreign merchants. Everything unravelled when a jade imperial seal belonging to Cixi appeared in the collection of a French consular officer in Shanghai. The court exploded in outrage. Li Lianying, in an effort to save face and his own political position, immediately accused Liu of treason and colluding with barbarians to steal from the emperor. Liu was arrested and interrogated by the Ministry of Justice. Even under torture, he refused to name any accomplices. But for the crimes of high treason and theft of imperial property, he was sentenced to 3 days of lingqi. At the execution grounds just south of Beijing, hundreds gathered to witness what was known as the most horrific punishment of the age. The executioners, veterans of the art, calm and precise like surgeons, stepped forward with razor-sharp knives. They didn't rush, they weren't angry, they cut as if slicing meat in the market. On the first day, they removed Liu's cheeks, nose, ears, and began slicing at his arms and thighs. The screams rang out but soon faded as opium was dripped onto his wounds, not to ease the pain, but to keep him conscious, alert through every cut, all the way to the end. The second day, they turned to the torso, slicing the chest and abdomen open, letting blood ooze steadily. Each cut was measured, careful not to sever major arteries. His heart kept beating. The crowd, half horrified, half entranced, watched each motion in silence. Some even began counting the cuts, as if watching a grotesque martial performance. By the third day, Liu was no longer human, just a bloody, pulsing red husk. Only then did the executioner deliver the final blow, slitting his throat and ending the nightmare. Liu Jingxi's death wasn't merely a punishment. It was a warning to every official and court servant: betray the dynasty, and your body and soul will be shredded. For in traditional Chinese belief, a person who dies with a mutilated body cannot reincarnate. Lingqi didn't just destroy flesh, it damned the spirit. Despite its horror, lingqi remained legal for nearly 1,000 years in Imperial China. It was only formally abolished in 1905, under pressure from modernizing reformers and harsh criticism from the West. But the image it left behind, the glint of the blade, the steady drip of blood on the execution ground, the cold faces in the crowd, the terror in the victims' eyes, remains one of the most haunting legacies of traditional Chinese justice. In medieval Europe, witches were believed to be evil beings who harmed others and brought plagues, famine, and unnatural disasters. And naturally, there were punishments for those accused of being witches and endangering society. The idea of burning witches alive took root in Europe around the 14th century, when the Catholic Church and political authorities began looking for invisible enemies to blame for misfortunes like the Black Death, failed harvests, wars, and other events beyond the understanding of that era. In a society where religion governed every corner of life, a witch, wasn't simply a woman mixing herbs or telling fortunes. She was seen as someone who had made a pact with the devil, who had betrayed God and brought harm to the community. And so, burning at the stake became a sacred act of purification. The law at the time, especially with the publication of the notorious Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches, in 1487, turned fear and superstition into legal doctrine. Elderly women living alone, midwives, herbal healers, or anyone who behaved differently could be branded a witch. Unlike hanging or beheading, burning alive carried strong symbolic meaning. Fire was believed to be divine, a holy force that could cleanse sin and liberate the soul from the devil. The accused would be tied to a wooden stake with straw and firewood piled at their feet. Occasionally, to spare them pain, a pouch of gunpowder might be tied around the waist to create a quick death. But that was a rare mercy. Guilt was often proven through torture. The rack, water dunking or skin flaying. If the victim confessed, they were burned. If they refused to confess, they were burned anyway. Because silence was taken as proof of allegiance with Satan. Though the roots of witch burning were in Europe, the hysteria eventually crossed the ocean, bringing terror to the New World. The most infamous case? The Salem witch trials in Massachusetts, USA, in 1692. It all began when a group of young girls in the village, including Betty Paris and Abigail Williams, started having strange fits, screaming and convulsing. A local doctor, unable to find a medical cause, concluded witchcraft. Under community pressure, the girls began naming names, often accusing poor, quiet, or socially estranged women, or those with personal conflicts with their families. Mass hysteria broke out. Within months, over 200 people were accused of witchcraft. 19 were hanged, and one man, Giles Corey, was crushed to death under heavy stones for refusing to confess. An entire community descended into fear and suspicion. The bitter truth? Nearly all the victims were innocent. Years later, the court admitted its error and offered compensation to victims' families. But the fires of those executions left psychological scars that lasted for generations. Starting in the 17th century, as science and the Age of Enlightenment gained ground, belief in real witches began to fade. Intellectuals spoke out, and public opinion turned against the brutal and baseless trials. In many regions, witch burning was gradually abolished. However, it wasn't until the late 18th to early 19th century that the flames were fully extinguished across most of Europe. In remote areas, though, unofficial burnings continued, justified as acts of community self-defense. Today, we understand that most witch burnings were driven by ignorance, fear, and hatred, disguised under the cloak of morality. Those who burned weren't witches. They were mothers, sisters, midwives, healers, and women brave enough to live differently in a society that feared difference. The fires are gone, but the ashes of that cruelty still linger in the memory of human history. And perhaps the most important lesson isn't in the flame itself, but in the haunting question. What were we so afraid of that we chose to burn another human being alive? Besides burning at the stake, another form of torture no less savage was the rack, one of the most refined instruments of torment devised in medieval Europe. At first glance, it looked deceptively simple. A large wooden frame with two rollers, one at each end, hands tied to one side, feet to the other. But don't be fooled by its plain appearance, because just a few gentle turns were enough to turn your shoulder joints, elbows, knees, and ankles into a grotesque symphony. No rhythm, no harmony, just dry, splintering crack sounds, like brittle branches breaking in the cold. The rack wasn't designed to kill outright. Its purpose was simple, to make the accused talk. Whether the confession was true or false didn't matter. What mattered was saying whatever the authorities, the church, or the interrogators wanted to hear. It might be a confession of treason, a denunciation of your friends, or something as simple as nodding your head and saying, "Yes, I'm a witch," in the hope of a quicker death. Once the arms were secured to the left roller and the legs to the right, the guards would begin to turn, slowly. At first, just tension in the muscles, then the shoulders would pop, then the hips, then the knees, ankles, and at some point you'd hear your own body coming apart, and you'd cry. But not with tears, with fractured breaths, with screams that couldn't make it past your crushed throat. One of the most famous victims of the rack was Guy Fawkes. the central figure in the gunpowder plot of 1605. Fawkes and his co-conspirators planned to blow up the English Parliament in an attempt to assassinate King James III and replace him with a Catholic monarch. The plot was discovered at the last moment. Fawkes was captured in the cellar with barrels of gunpowder. At first, he remained silent, refusing to give up names or speak at all. But then, he was taken to the Tower of London, where the rack awaited. There are no surviving records that detail the full course of the interrogation, but history notes this. Guy Fawkes' signature before and after torture looked like they came from two entirely different people. The first document bears a firm, clear signature, Guido Fawkes. The second, after a few turns on the rack, is nothing more than a shaky scrawl, like a trembling child trying to draw lines. Not because he was afraid, but because his hands no longer had any intact joints to hold a pen. The rack wasn't illegal. In the medieval period, it was considered a legitimate tool of investigation, a sanctioned method of extracting truth. Kings, bishops, even courts of law had full authority to order its use. In Tudor England, from Henry VIII onward, it was an essential part of a system obsessed with finding the truth at all costs. Its victims were usually suspected traitors, spies, or heretics. The dangerous elements society had to eliminate by any means necessary. Those who survived the rack almost never walked properly again. Most were left crippled for life. Dislocated shoulders, twisted limbs, torn ligaments. As for the spine, it's probably better we don't speak of it. And yet, strangely, this form of punishment persisted well into the 17th century. And in some places, it wasn't even considered barbaric. It was seen as justified. Because the truth, even if mangled, seemed to matter more than the life of a human being. If you've heard of St. Catherine of Alexandria, then you're probably familiar with the breaking wheel, a punishment so symbolic of cruelty that it haunted Europe for more than 6 centuries. The Catherine wheel, as it came to be known, originated in European legal codes around the 12th century. It was reserved for severe crimes, treason, murder, armed robbery, or grave acts of heresy. In medieval law, the wheel symbolized absolute justice, both a torture device and a public sentence meant to display this chilling message. Those who defy justice will be shattered limb by limb, with no path to return. Executions were conducted publicly, often in town squares or just outside city gates. The condemned was tied to the wheel face up, arms and legs spread wide. In many cases, the wheel was turned 90 degrees so that the victim lay horizontally. Then came the executioners. Armed with hammers or iron rods, they would strike joint by joint, beginning with the limbs, forearms, knees, calves, before moving to major joints like the shoulders and hips. Each blow had to be precisely calculated, hard enough to break bones but not so forceful as to cause instant death. The goal, to keep the victim alive. This process often lasted for hours, sometimes an entire day. In the final stage, the wheel was hoisted upright, raising the broken body high like an inverted crucifix. The shattered limbs didn't fall away but clung grotesquely to the wheel, turning the corpse into a gruesome ornament of justice. In some merciful versions of the sentence, the victim would be finished off with a stab to the heart or a swift beheading, but that was never the point. The punishment was crafted for spectacle, a slow, public agony meant to terrify the masses. Legend tells us of St. Catherine of Alexandria, a noblewoman from 4th century Egypt, who was intelligent, well-versed in philosophy, and openly challenged Emperor Maxentius for persecuting Christians. The emperor initially permitted a public debate between Catherine and his court philosophers, but when she soundly defeated them, he ordered her to be executed on the wheel. But then, something miraculous happened. As Catherine was bound to the wheel, the moment she touched it, it shattered into pieces. Some say an angel descended, smashing the wheel to spare her the torment. She was eventually beheaded, swiftly and quietly, as the stories in the capital would later say. From that moment on, the device became known as the Catherine wheel, a symbol of brave women and unyielding faith. While the tale has clear elements of myth and divine intervention, it also inspired the widespread use of the wheel as a legal instrument, particularly for punishing heresy and disobedience to the Church. St. Catherine became a spiritual symbol, and the wheel, ironically, became a tool of the very oppression she opposed. By the 13th century, the breaking wheel was widely used in courts across France, Germany, Spain, and England. Public executions via wheel were documented in cities like Cologne, Paris and Rome, as well as in smaller towns. Church law and feudal justice permitted its use even on children and pregnant women, though women were sometimes given a lighter fate, such as hanging instead of being bludgeoned with iron. Gradually, however, by the 17th century, the Enlightenment brought with it a shift in attitudes toward human rights and criminal justice. More and more clergy, physicians and scholars began to denounce the wheel as inhumane and incompatible with true justice. By the late 18th century, most European nations had abolished the practice. The wheel vanished from execution sites, and justice began to move, slowly, from pain to reform, from retribution to rehabilitation. What the breaking wheel left behind wasn't just an image of medieval cruelty. It was a historical scar, marking a society where honour, faith and power were often defended through blood and spectacle. They didn't just execute the accused. They turned the human body into a cautionary tale, a living sermon carved in pain. Today, the wheel survives only in museums, in legal history exhibits, or carved into stone etchings, with wooden fragments, iron hooks, and illustrated panels that depict the execution process. In the modern world, it stands as a reminder of how far we've come in our understanding of justice, and how, once upon a time, we thought the path to truth had to run through shattered bones. In the grim treasury of medieval torture, the red-hot iron helmet stands as a haunting symbol, not only of physical brutality, but of the psychological horror it left behind. There were no prolonged screams, no torrents of blood soaking the cold stone floor. Only the stench of burning flesh, the shrill screech of metal against human skin, and a face so disfigured it was no longer recognisable. Unlike other torture devices meticulously documented in historical texts, the heated iron helmet remains shrouded in ambiguity. Some records trace its use to 14th century Europe, particularly during the Inquisitions in France, Germany and Spain. Although not widely used, its every appearance was tied to bloody purges, where faith burned alongside the flesh. The helmet resembled the iron headgear worn by knights of the era, but heavier, more airtight, forged from solid metal. It was typically sealed shut, with only 2 narrow slits left for the eyes and mouth, barely enough to breathe. Before use, the helmet would be placed in a roaring fire, taking up to 30 minutes to reach the desired heat. Once glowing red, a torturer, donning thick iron gloves, would clamp the searing helmet onto the victim's head, swiftly and forcefully. Within seconds the scalp would ignite. The ears, forehead, cheeks, blistered, charred and shrivelling like scorched parchment. The eyes might melt into blindness. The throat, parched and scorched, could become too raw to scream. Unlike tools like the Iron Maiden or the crushing boot, the red-hot helmet was not designed to kill. Its purpose was to ruin. Those who survived the ordeal were left permanently disfigured. Some had no skin left on their scalps, exposing the bare skull beneath. Some were blinded, mute, or unable to eat or speak normally ever again. But perhaps the cruelest pain was not physical. It was the gaze of others. Fear, pity, or worse, indifference. The victim could survive, but they would never return to normal life. In a society where faith and personal image were deeply intertwined, a disfigured face was seen as a mark of sin. You might be alive, but you were no longer seen as human. The red-hot helmet was often used to punish heretics, those who dared to question doctrine, hear another voice, or simply refuse to stay silent. Women in particular, especially those labelled as witches or even just too outspoken, were frequent victims. One 15th century record from southern Germany recounts the case of a nun forced to wear the red-hot helmet after she claimed to have seen angels in a dream. In an era where heresy was feared like a plague, such words were not inspiration. They were grounds for burning her face rather than listening to her soul. Today, very few artifacts of the red-hot helmet survive, not because it never existed, but because most were destroyed, hidden, or erased, as though history itself was ashamed to remember them. A few reconstructed models remain in torture museums in Germany, Austria and Spain, quiet, tucked away in dark corners under dim yellow lights. There are no screams, no blood, just the iron helmet, and the imagined face of whoever it once consumed. Alongside the red-hot iron helmet, the wooden horse was no less excruciating. At first glance, it was merely a vertical plank of wood, sharpened like a saddle's spine, yet it could rip open the victim's genitals, cause massive blood loss, and sometimes even kill in agony. This device appeared deceptively harmless, almost like a carpenter's craft project, but behind it lay a system of punishment laced with cruelty and humiliation. The wooden horse, also known as the Spanish donkey or wooden mare, first appeared in European military records in the 14th century, but was likely used even earlier by mercenary units and royal guards. Its structure was simple, an inverted triangular wooden frame with the sharp edge pointing upward, like the raised spine of a steed. Beneath it were 4 sturdy legs, typically 1 to 1.5 meters tall, forcing the victim to climb and sit precariously, unable to touch the ground. The top edge was often sharpened to a fine point, sometimes even reinforced with metal to maximize injury. The punished individual, usually forced to remove their pants, would be made to sit astride the sharp ridge, as though riding a horse. Their legs were tied down on either side, and weights were sometimes hung from their ankles, driving their entire body weight down onto the sharpened edge, crushing the groin. Unlike many execution tools, the wooden horse was not meant to kill. It was a deterrent punishment, a lesson carved into flesh. Most victims survived, but only just, often with irreversible damage to the genital area, torn skin, severe bleeding, infections, and in the worst cases, permanent loss of reproductive function. For men, the agony extended beyond the physical. It attacked their pride and manhood. Many were forced to ride the horse in public, stripped and exposed, as others stood by and laughed. Historical records recount that in French, Italian, and Spanish military camps during the Renaissance, the wooden horse stood outdoors, a silent warning to new recruits. Whenever someone was punished, the rest of the troops were forced to cheer and applaud like a cruel circus, reinforcing discipline and absolute obedience to their superiors. Some military logs from Napoleonic France and 17th century England describe the aftermath in chilling detail. Blood trailed down his thighs. The wound had turned gangrenous. The soldier could neither stand nor walk, and his cries echoed for 3 days straight. When finally removed, he could no longer sit. Lying down brought no comfort either. Some survivors of the wooden horse bore lifelong psychological wounds. They lost the ability to have children, lost sensation entirely, or even lost the ability to urinate normally. But in those times, these after-effects weren't considered medical trauma, just the price of insolence. In Spain, Italy and Germany, the punishment was later modified for women, especially those accused of adultery or talking back to their husbands. Some rural village councils had smaller versions of the wooden horse placed in the middle of marketplaces, where women were forced to sit for hours, surrounded by mockery and verbal abuse. In 16th century Holland, women who were accused of riding over their husbands, asserting control in the household, were made to literally ride the wooden horse as a way to reteach them their place. During the French Revolution, local militia used the wooden horse to punish suspected spies or traitors. Though no longer a formal part of the justice system, it persisted in practice, a symbolic weapon of humiliation. By the 18th and 19th centuries, the use of the wooden horse began to decline, swept aside by humanitarian movements and legal reform. It was finally categorized as a form of degrading punishment and disappeared from both military camps and town squares. Yet replicas of the wooden horse still exist in historical museums, grim exhibits of a time when crushing the genitals was considered a valid way to preserve order. In popular culture today, the wooden horse is often found in macabre stories or as a darkly comical symbol of punishment. But in history, it was all too real and all too sharp. Leaving behind the medieval age, we now step into the early modern era, a time of transition into a new world shaped by science, reason, colonialism, and reform. But it was also a time when humankind remained shackled by deep-rooted prejudice, fanatic beliefs, and oppressive rule. Punishment, though increasingly questioned, had not yet disappeared. Torture tools from this era became both more refined and colder in execution, mirroring the fear of a society caught in the throes of change. Now imagine a form of execution that doesn't start with a beheading, burning, or hanging, but with honey. Sounds sweet, doesn't it? But that sweetness was merely the bait for one of the most haunting methods of execution in recorded history, scaphism, or as it's been nicknamed, honeyed, then left for the ants. The word scaphism comes from the Greek scapha, scaphi, meaning small boat. But this wasn't a boat to carry you to freedom. It was a floating coffin, a deadly trap shaped like a canoe, designed to imprison the victim in a slow, methodical torture, sometimes stretching on for days or even weeks, using the most relentless executioner of all, insects. According to Greek historians like Plutarch, scaphism was used by ancient Persians to punish grave offences, especially treason against the gods or the royal bloodline. The most infamous case was that of Mithridates, a courtier accused of attempting to assassinate King Artaxerxes Thesu, who ruled Persia in the 5th century BCE. And Mithridates' fate. He wasn't beheaded. He wasn't thrown into a pit of fire. He was subjected to scaphism, a death that was slow, agonizing, and deeply dehumanizing. The process began by placing the victim between two wooden boats, or hollowed-out logs, one laid over the other like a human sandwich. Only the head, arms, and legs stuck out through the holes, just enough to keep them alive but utterly immobilized. Next, the executioners poured milk, honey, or syrup over the exposed parts, especially the face, eyes, mouth, and genitals. Then they force-fed the victim large quantities of milk and honey, triggering uncontrollable diarrhea inside the confined space. And then, the victim was set adrift on a still lake or swamp surrounded by nature's tiniest, deadliest executioners. Ants, flies, maggots, wasps, beetles. The combination of rotting food, bodily waste, and sugary residue attracted swarms of insects. They crawled into the ears, nostrils, and mouth, laid eggs in blistered flesh, and began eating the victim alive bit by bit. There were no blades, no blood spurting through the air, just a soft, persistent sound of moaning, stretched over days, even weeks, as the body became a feast for creatures smaller than a fingernail. Some ancient sources claim Mithridates survived 70 days in this state before death finally came. Scaphism was never as widespread as decapitation or burning, perhaps because it was too elaborate, too time-consuming, and required too many resources. 2 boats, a body of water, honey, insects. And yet, it's that very rarity that has etched it so vividly into historical memory, as an example of how far human cruelty could go when seeking punishment. Today, historians still debate the authenticity of scaphism. Some argue it may have been exaggerated myth crafted by Greek writers, but the consistency of its description across ancient texts makes it difficult for scholars to dismiss it outright. Somewhere, at some point in time, this may have actually happened. In an era where honour, status, and royal favour could be overturned with nothing more than a monarch's flick of the wrist, a person's head, whether that of a commoner or a queen, could just as easily fall to the ground at the mere utterance of an accusation. Public beheading wasn't just a method of execution, it was a ritual display of sovereign power, a symbolic weapon of deterrence brandished before the masses. What made this punishment distinct was its public nature. The condemned would be brought out before a crowd of onlookers. Bound tightly, they'd place their neck on a wooden block, and then the executioner, a professional in his craft, would swing his sword or axe to sever the head in one clean strike. The choice of weapon varied by region. In France, the sword was commonly used, in England, the great axe, while in Ming and Qing dynasty China, it was the wide-bladed dao. Public executions weren't just about making an example of someone. They were meant to let the people witness justice firsthand, to instill fear and ensure obedience to the crown or state. Some executions even resembled public festivals, onlookers gathering with food, bringing stools, and sometimes even children in tow. Though seemingly straightforward, beheading was a craft that required technique. A clean, precise strike could offer the condemned a swift, nearly painless death. But a shaky hand or an inexperienced executioner might take 2 or 3 attempts, inflicting horrific pain. This is why kings and queens sometimes granted the condemned a privilege to be executed by sword instead of axe. The sword allowed for a quicker, cleaner death. One notable case is that of Anne Boleyn, the second wife of King Henry VIII. Accused of adultery, treason and incest, Anne was granted the rare favour of a French executioner with a sword. Her death was eerily graceful, even chilling in its calm. She knelt, forgave the king aloud, and was beheaded in a single stroke. Contrary to popular belief, beheading was not reserved for nobles or royals. Peasants, monks, soldiers, and even miners could find themselves under the blade, depending on the nature of their crime. In Tokugawa-era Japan, for instance, samurai who committed seppuku, ritual suicide by disembowelment, were often finished off by a comrade's sword, a final act of mercy and honour. In England, hundreds perished under the axe at Tower Hill or Tower Green, inside and outside the Tower of London. Among them were nobles like Thomas More, queens like Catherine Howard, and even common rebels. As nations inched toward the modern age, the solemnity once associated with beheadings began to fade. Executions became bloody spectacles, often more vengeful than just, drawing criticism from the public. By the 19th century, many European countries moved toward private executions and eventually abolished beheading as a form of capital punishment altogether. Still, the memory of those public executions lives on, in historical records, paintings, literature and film, and the image of a head tumbling into the dust beneath the afternoon sun, amid cheers or chilling silence, remains one of the most haunting emblems of justice in the pre-modern world. In the strict and deeply symbolic legal system of ancient Rome, the crime of killing one's parents, known as parricidium, was considered one of the most heinous offences imaginable. To punish such a transgression, the Romans didn't settle for simple execution. Instead, they devised a particularly gruesome and ritualistic punishment known as punacule, or the punishment of the sack. This punishment was not merely about ending a life. It was a public ritual designed to represent a complete rejection of the offender from the world of the living. The person guilty of parricide would be bound hand and foot, blindfolded, and then stuffed into a large leather sack. But what made the punishment truly terrifying was not just the confinement. Inside the sack, the Romans would place a dog, a rooster, a snake, and sometimes even a monkey. The sack would then be sewn shut and thrown into the Tiber River, symbolizing the spiritual expulsion of the criminal. They would receive no burial, never see the sun again, and leave no trace behind, as though they never existed. A documented case appears in the Digest of Justinian, the famed compilation of Roman law. It recounts a chilling incident. A man was accused of poisoning his own parents. Despite his claims of innocence, evidence and testimony from household slaves led to a conviction, and the sentence of punacule. Disturbingly, during the execution, the snake inside the sack bit him to death before the sack could even be thrown into the river. The Romans placed immense value on familial order and ancestral piety, what they called pietas. To murder one's own parents was to shatter that sacred foundation. And so the punishment had to reflect not just the severity of the crime, but the total loss of morality it represented. This was not merely a death. It was a death in isolation, surrounded by symbols of madness and inhumanity, and ultimately a disappearance from the earth itself, as if the criminal had never deserved to be remembered. Punacule faded into obscurity with the decline of the Roman Empire, but its legacy still haunts legal scholars, historians, and criminologists to this day. It reminds us that ancient justice did not punish only through pain, but through symbolism, fear, and public humiliation. As Europe entered the early modern period, the use of the knee splitter, or knee breaking, became widespread between the 15th and 17th centuries. It emerged in a time marked by intense fear of heresy, when powerful religious institutions, especially the Inquisition, were unafraid to use any means necessary to protect the true faith. Europe was undergoing major religious upheaval. Reformist movements were rising, new beliefs were challenging established doctrine, and ordinary people were beginning to question traditional teachings. Those who refused to comply with the church, or were merely suspected, could be accused of heresy. And once accused, they often faced some of the most brutal methods of interrogation. Among them, the terrifying knee splitter. The device itself was simple, but its effectiveness was horrifying. It consisted of two metal bars, each lined with serrated edges or iron spikes, placed opposite each other and connected by tightening bolts. The victim's knees, or sometimes elbows or forearms, would be placed between the two iron faces. Then the torturer would slowly turn the screws, forcing the bars together, crushing the kneecap and soft tissue in between. The horror of the device didn't lie in instant death, but in the drawn-out agony, accompanied by the cracking sound of bones shattering. Even if the victim survived the session, they would never walk again. The injuries often led to gangrene, infection, and a slow, painful death from blood loss or shock. Psychologically, the trauma was equally devastating. Survivors lived with fear, lifelong disability and social stigma. But why the knees? Why not the hands or the neck? Because the knee was a symbol of submission. In religious ritual, one kneels to show reverence to God. To break the knees was not just to destroy the body, but to strip away one's ability to kneel, to pray, to repent. It sent a chilling message. Anyone who defied the true faith would not only be physically destroyed, but also denied the chance of salvation. This tool was frequently used during Inquisition trials. Suspected witches, heretics, or even those who simply refused to confess could be dragged out and subjected to this torment. From women and peasants to scholars and reformist clergy, no one was spared. There are many accounts of interrogations held in the dark chambers of ancient monasteries. Damp stone walls, flickering candlelight, the stench of blood and fear soaking into the very bricks. There, the sickening crack of breaking bones echoed like some demonic melody. By the 18th century, as Enlightenment and humanitarian ideals began to spread, such barbaric methods like the knee splitter were increasingly condemned and ultimately abolished. Yet the trauma it left behind endured in European folklore and collective memory, a reminder of how faith and fear were once bound together by pain. One form of punishment, or more accurately, a deeply rooted cultural practice, that still persists in some parts of the world today is genital mutilation. This is not a tradition tied to any single culture, but rather a practice that has independently emerged in various regions, particularly in parts of sub-Saharan Africa, the Middle East, and some minority communities in Asia. Tracing its origins, this custom developed as part of local belief systems, gender roles, and rites of passage. From ancient times up until today, this practice has endured, despite extensive efforts by the international community, human rights organisations, and national laws to eradicate it. The act, commonly referred to as mutilation due to its destruction of biological structure, typically involves the burning or cutting of the female genitalia and is most often performed on young girls and adolescent women. The most common forms include the partial or total removal of the clitoris, and in some cases the sealing of the vaginal opening, infibulation. In certain communities, crude tools such as razor blades, shards of glass, or heated metal are used to cleanse what is seen as impure parts of the body. Many of these communities believe that the procedure helps preserve virginity, keep women pure, or suppress sexual desire, because the ideal woman, in these traditions, is one who is obedient to her husband. In coming-of-age ceremonies, girls are often forcibly restrained by their mothers, grandmothers, or elder women of the village, while the ritual is performed in front of witnesses. Unlike other torture methods used to punish criminals or heretics, genital mutilation is not usually carried out as a punishment. Rather, it functions as a transitional rite, marking a girl's passage into womanhood. Tragically, many survivors, despite enduring excruciating pain, infection, or even death, grow up believing that it was necessary, for their community, for their honour. Girls as young as 5 or 7 years old have died from blood loss, shock, or infection. Others suffer lifelong consequences, scar tissue, urinary problems, complications in childbirth, or psychological trauma. In many modern communities, a combination of weak legal enforcement and cultural pressure means that girls are still forced to undergo this ritual, even where it is banned by law. The World Health Organization, WHO, and UNICEF estimate that millions of girls each year remain at risk of being mutilated. Although this practice is no longer a formal legal punishment in most parts of the world, its survival in the shadows, under the banner of tradition and honour, makes the fight to eliminate genital mutilation more difficult than ever. Finally, we come to the punishment known as ear cropping, a symbolic form of discipline that appeared very early in both Europe and Asia. It was especially common in feudal societies, where public humiliation played a vital role in maintaining social order. From the 12th to the 19th centuries, this punishment was used to deal with less serious crimes that still required public warning, such as theft, fraud, or repeat offences. Unlike capital punishment or severe torture, ear cropping was not fatal, but it served as a lifelong mark, often referred to as the scar of disgrace, highly visible from a distance, a punishment aimed more at honour than at the body. It was a cross between physical and psychological punishment, where the ear was no longer just a body part but a living billboard of a person's crime. Depending on the country or dynasty, the cropping could be done on the left ear, right ear, or both, with different symbolic meanings. In 16th century England under King Henry VIII, A first-time thief might have their left ear cropped, while a repeat offender would lose the right ear. Some professional thieves could lose both ears, a clear sign to the public. This person has repeatedly failed to repent. In parts of Asia, especially Imperial China, ear cropping was also used as a supplementary punishment. Ancient texts document cases where escaped slaves or exiled criminals were punished this way to make them easier to identify and control. During chaotic periods or in lawless frontier regions, human ears were even collected as trophies, a disturbing distortion of the original punishment. Though it may seem like just an ear, the consequences of this punishment could last a lifetime. In societies where honour mattered deeply, losing one's ear meant being cast out from the community. It was hard to find work, marry, or reintegrate, because a missing ear was proof that someone had committed a crime, even if it had happened long ago. In small towns, where everyone knew each other, a person with a damaged ear essentially walked around with a permanent criminal sign, forever denied a chance at redemption. Physically, the punishment could also lead to complications such as infection, excessive bleeding, or even permanent nerve damage. By the 19th century, ear cropping gradually disappeared from legal systems in both Europe and Asia. This was due to the rise of modern human rights principles, which rejected punishments based on public shaming, the development of prisons and criminal records, which replaced the need to mark criminals' bodies to distinguish them. Today, ear cropping exists only in historical records, or is sometimes confused with veterinary procedures done on animals, such as dogs or cats, which itself remains a controversial topic in animal rights debates. Cruel punishments such as burning at the stake, knee crushing, ear cropping, or genital mutilation are not merely evidence of brutality. They are reflections of belief systems, power structures, and how justice was once perceived. When we look at them, we don't just see blood, fire, and screams. We see a society that truly believed pain was a path to justice. Yet the final question remains. Today, when people wear suits and sit in modern courtrooms, have punishments truly become more humane? When death sentences are carried out by lethal injection and prisoners spend decades in solitary confinement, do you believe today's punishments are more humane? Or do some crimes still deserve harsher punishments for those horrors that feel beyond forgiveness? And so, our journey through the punishments of the past slowly draws to a close, not with the crack of a whip or the screams from a gallows, but with a quiet reflection on how humankind once defined justice and retribution. And then, in the stillness of night, between the haze of past and present, let us dream of a day when justice no longer demands blood, when punishment no longer carries the weight of fear and dread. Sleep well, and in your gentle dreams, may the cruel punishments of old dissolve into silent lessons, reminding us to love justice without losing our humanity.